James Hetfield dismissed Kurt Cobain as not real metal. What happened next changed how the metal world saw grunge forever. September 1991, backstage at the Monsters of Rock Festival in Castle Donington, England. Metallica was headlining, riding the massive wave of their Black Album success. They were metal gods, pioneers who had dragged the genre from underground clubs to stadium stages. James Hetfield, at 28, was the undisputed voice of heavy metal, the man who defined what it meant to be heavy, aggressive, and uncompromisingly metal. The festival was a showcase of metal's elite. Metallica, AC/DC, Motley Crue, and Queensryche commanded the main stages. But there was also a smaller side stage featuring newer acts, bands that didn't quite fit the traditional metal mold. One of those bands was Nirvana, fresh off the underground success of Bleach and just weeks away from releasing Nevermind. Nobody expected much from them. They were lumped in with the alternative acts, the college radio bands that the metal crowd typically ignored. Grunge was still a Seattle phenomenon, unknown to most of the leather and denim army that had descended on Donington. Hetfield was in the backstage catering area, holding court with other musicians and industry people. He was animated, confident, talking about the state of metal, about how Metallica had proven that heavy music could be both uncompromising and commercially successful. The conversation naturally drifted to the newer bands on the bill. "What about that Seattle band?" someone asked. "Nirvana?" Hetfield took a long drink from his beer and shook his head dismissively. "That's not metal," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped define the genre. "That's just noise with no technique. Sloppy playing, can't sing properly, no real power. Metal requires discipline, precision. These grunge kids just bash away and call it heavy." Several people around the table nodded in agreement. Hetfield continued, warming to his subject. "Real metal comes from years of practice, understanding your instrument, knowing how to create genuine heaviness, not just turning up loud and making a mess. These Seattle bands, they're amateurs pretending to be heavy." What Hetfield didn't know was that Kurt Cobain had entered the catering area and was standing just a few feet behind him, having heard most of the conversation. Kurt had come in quietly, looking for something to eat before Nirvana's set. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, ripped jeans, and beat-up Converse sneakers. Next to the leather-clad metal musicians, he looked like he'd wandered in from the wrong festival. Kurt stood there for a moment, listening to Hetfield's assessment of his music, his band, his entire artistic approach. His face showed no emotion. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just absorbed the words, processing them in that quiet way he had. Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, appeared beside Kurt and heard the tail end of Hetfield's critique. He looked at Kurt, expecting some kind of reaction, maybe anger or hurt, but Kurt's expression remained neutral, almost detached. "You okay?" Dave whispered. Kurt nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm fine." Someone in Hetfield's group noticed Kurt standing there, and the conversation awkwardly died down. There was a moment of uncomfortable recognition as people realized who had been listening. Hetfield turned around and saw Kurt for the first time. The metal frontman was tall, imposing, with shoulder-length blonde hair, and the kind of presence that commanded attention. Kurt, by contrast, seemed to shrink slightly, his shoulders hunching forward in that characteristic defensive posture. "Hey," Hetfield said, not unkindly but with a slight edge of challenge. "Didn't see you there." "No problem," Kurt replied softly. His voice was barely above a whisper, so different from Hetfield's commanding baritone. There was an awkward silence. Everyone knew what had just happened, but nobody quite knew how to address it. "Good luck with your set," Hetfield added, though his tone suggested he wasn't expecting much. Kurt nodded and started to turn away, but then he paused. "Actually," he said still quietly, "would you mind if I borrowed a guitar for a few minutes? I wanted to check something before we go on." Hetfield looked puzzled. "Sure, I guess. There are some practice amps set up in the equipment area." 20 minutes later, word had somehow spread through the backstage area that Kurt Cobain was playing in the equipment tent. It wasn't announced or planned, just one of those organic moments that happen at festivals when musicians gather to hear something unexpected. Hetfield, curious despite himself, wandered over with several other metal musicians. They found Kurt sitting on an equipment case with a borrowed Stratocaster, plugged into a small Marshall practice amp. The amp was turned up just loud enough to be heard over the festival noise outside. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 15 people, mostly musicians and crew. Kurt wasn't performing for them exactly. He seemed to be playing for himself, working through something internal. What came out of that small amp was unlike anything the metal musicians expected. Kurt started with a riff, but it wasn't the jangling, distorted sound they associated with grunge. This was different, heavier. The riff was simple but crushing, built around drop tuning that gave the guitar a massive, low-end presence. It sounded like Black Sabbath filtered through a Seattle sensibility. But it was the way Kurt played it that stopped everyone cold. There was nothing sloppy about his technique. Every note was deliberate, intentional. The distortion wasn't chaotic noise. It was controlled aggression, each chord ringing with purpose. Then Kurt began to sing. His voice, when he wasn't screaming or pushing it to its limits, had a haunting quality. It was raw but melodic, carrying pain in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. The lyrics were fragmentary, impressionistic, but they painted pictures of isolation and anger that felt more real than any metal anthem about war or rebellion. The song built slowly, layers of meaning emerging from the simplicity. Kurt's right hand moved with precision, creating rhythmic patterns that drove the song forward without ever feeling rushed. His left hand found chord voicings that were both heavy and beautiful, creating harmonic tension that resolved in unexpected ways. Hetfield watched Kurt's fingering technique, recognizing advanced harmonic concepts that he hadn't expected from someone dismissed as sloppy. Kurt was using interval jumps and chord inversions that created a wall of sound without relying on speed or complexity for complexity's sake. Every note served the song's emotional arc. The other metal musicians in the tent began to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't matching their preconceptions. Tony Iommi, the legendary Black Sabbath guitarist who had also been listening, nodded slowly in recognition. He understood what Kurt was doing, taking the fundamental principles of heavy music and filtering them through a completely different emotional lens. As the song progressed, Kurt began to push the amp harder, coaxing feedback that he controlled like another instrument. But this wasn't random noise. He was manipulating the feedback frequencies, bending them into melodic shapes, making the distortions serve the song rather than overwhelming it. The sound grew heavier, more aggressive, but never lost its melodic center. It was metal, but it was also something else, something more personal, more emotionally direct. Dave Mustaine, Megadeth's frontman who had also wandered over to listen, found himself studying Kurt's approach to dynamics. The way Kurt could make a quiet passage feel heavier than a loud one through pure emotional intensity was something Mustaine had never quite mastered. There was a lesson here about the difference between volume and power. Kurt's voice began to crack and strain, not from poor technique, but from the emotional weight of what he was expressing. The vulnerability in his delivery made the heavy passages hit even harder. When he screamed, it felt like genuine pain being processed through music, not theatrical aggression performed for effect. Hetfield found himself leaning forward, studying Kurt's technique. This wasn't the amateur playing he had dismissed earlier. This was someone who understood the instrument, who knew how to create genuine heaviness without relying on volume or speed. The song reached a crescendo where Kurt's voice broke into something raw and desperate, but even at its most aggressive, it never felt fake or theatrical. It felt like witnessing someone's actual pain being transformed into sound. When Kurt finished, there was complete silence in the equipment tent. Nobody moved or spoke for several seconds. The contrast between what they had just heard and their expectations was too dramatic to process immediately. Kurt unplugged the guitar and set it back in its stand. He looked around at the faces watching him, some surprised, some thoughtful, some visibly shaken. "Thanks for letting me use the guitar," he said to no one in particular, and started to walk toward the tent entrance. "Wait!" Hetfield called out. Kurt stopped and turned around. Hetfield looked uncomfortable, like someone wrestling with a realization he didn't want to accept. "What was that song?" "Just something I was working on," Kurt replied. "It's not finished." It was Hetfield paused, searching for words. It was really heavy. Kurt nodded. Thanks. I mean, really heavy. Like properly heavy. Not just loud, but actually heavy. Kurt studied Hetfield's face, seeing the confusion and emerging respect there. Yeah, he said simply. That's the point. There was another pause. Hetfield seemed to be struggling with something. Look, man, he said finally, I might have misjudged what you guys were doing. Kurt didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet but not bitter. It's okay. A lot of people don't understand it at first. No, it's not okay, Hetfield said, his voice gaining strength. I made assumptions. That was actually metal. Maybe more metal than some of the stuff I've been hearing lately. Kurt almost smiled. Metal doesn't have to sound like everything else, does it? Hetfield shook his head slowly. No, it doesn't. The two musicians looked at each other across the equipment tent, representatives of different approaches to heavy music, but connected now by a moment of understanding. Your set is coming up, Hetfield said. I think I'll watch it. And he did. When Nirvana took the stage an hour later, Hetfield was standing at the side of the stage, watching intently as Kurt and his band delivered a set that was both chaotic and controlled, both aggressive and melodic. The crowd, initially uncertain about this strange Seattle band, gradually warmed to the music's raw power. After Nirvana's set, Hetfield sought out Kurt again. That was something else, and he said, your band's got real power. Different from what I do, but real. Kurt nodded. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. The two men talked for a while about music, about different approaches to heaviness, about the challenge of staying authentic while reaching larger audiences. It was a conversation between equals, two artists who had found common ground despite their different styles. Years passed. Nirvana exploded into global stardom with Nevermind, while Metallica continued their own massive success. The two bands represented different sides of the early 90s rock revolution, but there was mutual respect between the camps. The influence of that brief encounter went deeper than anyone realized at the time. Hetfield began incorporating more melodic sensibilities into Metallica's songwriting. Songs like The Unforgiven and later Mama Syed showed a vulnerability that echoed what he had heard in Kurt's performance that day. The rigid boundaries between metal subgenres started to blur, with bands drawing inspiration from grunge's emotional directness. Other musicians who had witnessed that impromptu performance also changed their approach. Several metal acts began experimenting with quieter, more introspective passages, understanding that dynamics could create more impact than constant aggression. The lesson Kurt had demonstrated, that restraint could amplify power, became a guiding principle for a new generation of heavy music. The grunge explosion that followed validated everything Kurt had shown that day. Suddenly, bands that prioritized emotion over technical display were dominating radio and MTV. The authenticity that metal purists had dismissed as amateur became the most sought-after quality in rock music. Record labels scrambled to sign bands that could capture even a fraction of the raw honesty that Nirvana exemplified. But success came with a cost. As Nirvana's fame grew, Kurt struggled with the expectations and pressures that accompanied mainstream success. The same vulnerability that made his music so powerful also made him susceptible to fame's destructive aspects. Hetfield, who had learned to navigate metal stardom, watched from a distance as Kurt grappled with similar challenges. After Kurt's death in 1994, Hetfield was deeply affected. He had come to see Kurt as a true artist, someone who had found his own way to channel rage and pain into music. The tragedy felt personal, like losing someone who had taught him an important lesson about authenticity in art. But the full story of that backstage encounter didn't come out until much later. In a 2011 interview with Guitar World magazine, Hetfield finally talked about that day at Donington. I made a mistake that day, he said, a big one. I dismissed Kurt and his music without really listening to it, without understanding what he was trying to do. I had this narrow definition of what metal was supposed to be, and anything that didn't fit that definition, I wrote off as inferior. The interviewer asked what changed his mind. Kurt played one song, Hetfield said, one song on a borrowed guitar through a practice amp, and he showed me that heaviness isn't about following rules or fitting categories. It's about truth. Kurt's music had more genuine heaviness in it than a lot of bands who were trying much harder to sound metal. Do you think that encounter influenced your later work? Hetfield was quiet for a moment. Absolutely. After meeting Kurt, I started thinking differently about songwriting, about what it means to be heavy. Some of the more experimental stuff we did in the 90s, the more personal lyrics, the willingness to show vulnerability, the willingness to show vulnerability, that came from understanding what Kurt was doing. He showed me that strength and sensitivity weren't opposites. Any regrets about that initial judgment? Of course, Hetfield said. I wish I had understood sooner. I wish I had been more open-minded. Kurt was doing something revolutionary, and I almost missed it because it didn't sound like what I thought heavy music was supposed to sound like. It's a lesson I try to remember. Real innovation often comes from places you don't expect, in forms you don't recognize. The interviewer pressed further. What would you say to Kurt now if you could? Hetfield's voice became quiet, reflective. I'd tell him he was right. About everything. About music needing to be honest. About heaviness coming from the heart rather than just the amplifier. I'd tell him that he taught me something important about being an artist, and I'd apologize for not seeing it sooner. That Donington Festival became a turning point, not just for Hetfield personally, but for how the metal community viewed the emerging grunge scene. Many of the musicians who witnessed Kurt's impromptu performance went on to incorporate elements of grunge's emotional directness into their own music. The story became legendary among musicians, passed down as an example of how preconceptions can blind us to genuine artistry. It was a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that true heaviness, in music and in life, comes from authenticity rather than volume. James Hetfield challenged Kurt Cobain's legitimacy as a heavy musician. Kurt responded not with words, but with a single song that redefined what heaviness could be. In that moment, a metal legend learned that real power comes not from following established rules, but from finding your own truth and expressing it without compromise. The lesson resonates beyond music. Genius often appears in forms we don't expect, and wisdom sometimes means setting aside our assumptions to really listen to what someone else is trying to say.